and we're back in record time.
Good morning. This is the 15th or 16th conversation in a series of interviews called Voices of Harpswell. This is done through the American Egg Range, received a grant from the Maine State Bicentennial Commission, and also done through the generosity of other Harpswell people. And we are not necessarily talking to all native people or all people from away, quote unquote. I don't like that phrase, but we want different viewpoints on Harpswell. And this gentleman here with me this morning, I know, has some interesting stories. And could you tell us your name, please?
My name's Gerry York. I grew up on Orr's Island and in the late 50s and early 60s, and except for a brief stint living on Shebig Island, I've been pretty much right here for 63 years.
So what do you think of this morning fog? I don't want to throw you off your stride, but...
It looked a lot like yesterday morning's fog.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've been to my camp up in Rangeley, and it was foggy up there as well. So
It is, okay.
Well, I get anywhere near the water, and it's foggy lately.
I was coming across the bridge the other day and veered off to the right, and fog was so thick and heavy, I was going up Seymour's Hill before I realized
There
it.
you go.
Missed Great Island entirely. But I'll be serious now. You're somewhat of a history guy, I know, Gerry. Tell us a few things you know about Orr's and Bailey Island, Great Island history. We've had quite a few people talk about Harpswell Neck history, and our group has republished a pamphlet that was put out by the Harpswell Garden Club. We are in the process of having it printed in 1964 with a few additions. So we know considerably more about Harpswell Neck than we do about the islands. That's why we want to talk to people like you.
I can't say I'm any sort of expert on Great Island. There's enough on Orr's Island and Bailey Island to keep me pretty busy, but I can speak pretty knowledgeably about Orr's and Bailey's.
Yeah.
You want to go? How far back would you like to go?
Oh, as far back as you please. My uncle published a book on Harpswell and shipbuilding, and he was frustrated considerably by the fact that he couldn't find any information about shipyards on Orr's and Bailey Island in particular. So it turned out that there weren't any in his book. But
well, I don't think there were many to begin with anyway. I mean, it's not to say that someone didn't occasionally knock something together in their yard, but I think the only established boatyard on Orr's Island was the Wilson boatyard at Reed Cove, and they were the late 1800s, early, maybe even the early 1900s that they were in existence. I have no idea if there were any up around Cundy's Harbor or on Great Island, but not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
And Bailey Island had a few fellas that built Hampton boats, even before they were powered, when they were sail. But those were mid-1800s as well. But they didn't have they built in their shed behind the house.
Mm-hmm.
And then would roll them down to whichever shore was the most convenient, but no established boatyards anywhere on the islands that I know of.
Yeah, my uncle was convinced that there had been an early shipyard down Lowell's Cove on Orr's, but he couldn't find any evidence to
I've never heard of one.
Prove that, so he never printed it.
I've always wondered where the name Lowell's Cove came from. Maybe Mr. Lowell had a boatyard there, who knows, but none that I'm aware of, and no evidence that of any ways or most of Lowell's Cove has got a bold enough shore so that it wouldn't be easy launching anything. Up in the head of Flag Cove, it's pretty muddy, but I've never heard of one being up in there. So I think most of the shipbuilding, the larger vessels, were on the neck. Your shores over there are a little more gradual.
Yeah.
You might have been able to have something at Mackerel Cove or Lowell's Cove at Bailey Island, but again, not that I've heard of.
Okay.
But Bailey Island is kind of the forgotten sister of most of the islands. I think it was, it's now the destination because it's the end of Route 24.
Right.
Everybody goes, well, we're going to Bailey Island. And I said, have you heard of Wars Island? No, where's that? Well, you had to cross it to get to Bailey Island. But back in the day, back in the early 1700s, Bailey Island, not having a bridge to it, being the furthest out, was the last to get to begin to get settled to any extent. But it did have a character out there who was Will Black, who showed up in 1727 from down at Berwick and settled on the island. They say he squatted on it. He didn't own any of the property. The property was owned by folks that were not in residence, but they were aware that Will was there, and allowed him to continue to live there for a little over 20 years before the island was sold off to other interests, and he was. He ended up dying on Bailey Island, and his son moved to Orr's Island, and we kind of lose track of him at Orr's Island. This isn't quite the way I imagined telling this story. I don't have it well thought out in my mind as to the order that I wanted to tell it in. But Bailey Island and Orr's Island as well were pretty much dedicated to fishing. There wasn't enough depth of soil there to allow much farming. The north end of Orr's Island had more farms, but they were more not so much crops that were being grown as grass and a few beef cattle and horses, oxen to do some of the heavy work. But it was more hay fields up on the north end. South end of Orr's Island and all of Bailey Island were fishing communities.
You're from a fishing family of the famous book, Charlie York, Maine Goose Fisherman.
I am. And on the other side of my family, I'm from the Dowdies, who were also fishermen.
Right. So that was going to be my next question. So I'm sorry to interrupt you. Continue on.
Well, the Dowdies are relative newcomers. I think they showed up at Bailey Island sometime in the. Well, my grandfather, Wash Dowdy, is said to have been born and grown up on the Intervale on the Neck. Something we don't really like to advertise. We prefer to have everyone think he came right from Bailey Island, but. The Dowdy family started out in South Portland, and they kind of island hopped down through Casco Bay, Long Island and Shebig Island, and then Bailey Island. But that side of the family didn't show up until my grandfather, who was born in 1878, bought a house on Bailey Island and put his parents in it when he was 16 years old. He
must have had a good fishing trip.
It was one of his very first fishing trips, and he used the proceeds from that to buy the house and put his mother and father in it, and the house is still in the family and still exists on Bailey Island today. It's probably one of the I'm going to say the 3 oldest houses on Bailey Island anyway. I don't know how that compares with some of the other houses on the Neck and on Great Island, but it was probably built, I'm thinking it was like 1799, something like that.
Yeah. I think perhaps the oldest house in town is the Dunning House just across the bridge on the left. It's a two-story colonial house. It was built 1697, I believe.
Well, I would guess then it probably was one of the oldest.
Other than that, it's hard to tell. People didn't seem to write down things like that in the old days, I suppose.
Well, it's just like us today, you know, the things that happened during our lifetime, we go, why would anybody want to know about that? We all know about that. It's not history, but in reality, a couple of generations go by and it's history, and the newer generations don't know it. So it is important, but it didn't get written down in those days. They were too concerned with where the next meal was coming from and how to get the house built and settling new land and all of that sort of thing that comes with opening up a new area, colonializing. But yeah, the Yorks are also relative newcomers to Bailey Island. Even though Charlie York was there, his father and uncles came from Long Island over in the western part of the bay. They did eventually buy a good chunk of the north end of Bailey Island from Cook's Motel to where the bridge is now was all at one time belonged to the Yorks, and out on the point where Cook's Restaurant is. And I also think that's where Will Black originally settled, was on that north end of Bailey Island. That was an important end rather than what we think of now as the area around Mackerel Cove. That wasn't quite as important to the early settlers, I guess, as it seems to be to the more modern day settlers now.
Talk about banks fishing and stuff like that, Jerry. What do you know about that?
There were somewhere around, I'm going to say a dozen schooners that all fished on the banks. There were a number at Cundy's Harbor. Some were at Lowell's Cove at Orr's Island. Some were at Water Cove at Bailey Island. Mackerel Cove as well. And then I'm sure there were probably a dozen alone from the Neck.
Well, one of the reasons I ask is when I was young, which was some time ago, I recall Bill Johnson talking about going banks fishing, and some stories he told me about that. And what schooner would he have gone on?
I don't know that in particular. He might have, in some of the stories that have been published that he told, he might give you a name, but the schooner, the Linscott brothers at Lowell's Cove at Orr's Island owned several schooners, or had shares in several schooners, and they were usually the captains as well. But there was the Edmund F. Black, which was at Bailey Island. There was the Albert W. Black, which was at various times at Lowell's Cove at Orr's Island and at Water Cove. There was the Helen B. Thomas. She was at Mackerel Cove, and she's rather famous because up until the time that she was built down in Essex, Massachusetts, most fishing schooners all had a bowsprit, and a good many sailors were lost from the bowsprit of all types of ships when they would go out in bad weather to furl sails. And someone had the idea that you could build a schooner without a bowsprit, and it would still handle as well, and you wouldn't have to risk your life climbing out on the end of it. Nobody wanted to put up the money for something as new and untried as that, even though the builders in Massachusetts were sure that it could be done. And William Thomas at Bailey Island finally put up the money and had one built, and they were called knockabout schooners. It was a knockabout rig, and it was the first fishing schooner ever built without the bowsprit. He named it for his daughter, Helen Thomas. And there are some pictures of Mackerel Cove where you can see a couple of schooners in the cove with their sails up, drying the sails, and you can tell one of them is without a bowsprit. And is the Helen B. Thomas, but she was the first. There was the Lochinvar, which Charles Black was lost from. There was the Letty May, which was over at Shebig Island for a while.
Yeah, they were both built by the Allens. Oh, no.
Both of them, and both of them were owned by or captained by John Pinkham Toothaker.
Right.
And he sold the Lochinvar to the Yorks, and he sold the Letty May to the Dyers over at Shebig Island. There was the Robert and Carr down at Cundy's Harbor that belonged to the Watsons. Eva and Mildred, that the Prince family owned a big share of. Somewhere I've seen a list of a good list of the captains and the vessels that were on this east side of Harpswell. But the rest of the names don't come to me right off the bat. But they would generally go up to Dingley Island in Cundy's Harbor and take a load of ice on, and then leave for the banks, either the Grand Banks or George's Bank. A good many of those trips in the summer were for swordfish on George's Bank, and then winters they'd head for the Grand Banks.
That was going to be another of my questions. What were they fishing for? What was their most valuable catch? Would that have been swordfish and cod and fish like that?
Yeah, swordfish, certainly during the summer months when they're up on George's Bank. The rest of the time, codfish, hake, haddock, but codfish was king, as they say. That salted real well before there was refrigeration. You had to brine your fish in a salt solution so that it would preserve, and then dry it, pack it in barrels or in bales, and you could send it all over. I'm sure a lot of East Coast fish ended up out in the Midwest, and pioneers were carrying them in covered wagons, and they would stay dry, and you'd just peel them off like a piece of beef jerky. Or if they were, you could eat slack salted fish. Slack salted fish were not quite as salty, and generally to slack salted fish you would put it in a box, throw some salt on it, leave it on for anywhere from 24 to 48 hours, rinse the salt off and dry it in the sun. And you could eat that, strip it right off the skin and the backbone, and eat it as it was. The brine soaked fish was to preserve it and to soak more salt in it for preservative. And that, before you could eat it, you'd generally have to boil the salt out of it. You'd have to put it in water and let it soak, and dump the water off and let it soak again before you get enough salt out of it so that you could actually eat it. And a lot of the stuff that you get down east now that comes in a little wooden box is the heavily salted fish. Don't make the mistake I did and go, ooh, look, there's some salt fish, and pop a piece of that into your mouth. It'll turn you right inside out. You need to boil that kind of stuff. But it's still, even after you've boiled it a while and let it soak a while, it has enough salt in it so it'll raise your blood pressure in good shape. But then you can make a number of different dishes out of it, but you have to soak it first.
And there probably were fish drying stands on Oars and Baileys in those days. Did they dry them right there?
Yeah.
And salt them?
The Prince family fortune was pretty much made on salt fish. When you get to the end of Oars Island and you can see the Bailey Island Bridge in front of you, the Prince's store is on the right-hand side, and there's a large gravel parking lot there now. Before the bridge was started in 1926, that was just an open field, and that's where they had the flakes that they would set up to dry the fish on. The fish flakes were a structure that you could lay out the fish in the sun to dry. I have a picture of that whole field just full of drying fish. There weren't many cottages there at the time, and the whole area was devoted to drying fish. So the vessels would come in, unload at Prince's store. There were, between the present-day store and the bridge, there were a couple of warehouses there that they would store the fish in barrels of brine. They had a windmill there that pumped salt water up into the building so that they could create a brine. And then they would dry them, pack them into barrels, and then someone would come along. There was a Merriman from the Neck who had a vessel called the Railroad, I think. I don't remember which Merriman, but he's mentioned several times in some of the Prince's paperwork as having come and loaded a hold full of salt fish to take to Portland or to Boston or some other shipping distribution spot. Early on, I've just discovered too, at Land's End, where the gift shop was when I was a kid, there was also another large fish drying operation, and that was the mid-1700s. And I was quite surprised looking through some deeds and other records to see the size of the operation that was there. But there was a wharf there. There were several vessels that would moor between Jaquish Island, Turnip Island, and the end of Bailey's in what at that time they were calling that Sea Cove. But there were wharfs, there were drying stages where the parking lots are now for Land's End. So that was another large operation. And then I think at Lowell's Cove at Bailey Island, there was also another, I think the Johnsons had a fish drying operation there at one point as well. Drying and salting fish was a big deal. Everybody needed a preserved food that they could take with them on trips to the West, and salt fish was one of the primary ones. Salt fish, salt beef.
So have you been a fisherman in your lifetime?
I have. I was probably 11 when I got my first boat and some traps. I bought them from Louis Ward over on the Neck.
Captain Lou.
Captain Lou. I don't remember where I got the boat from, the skiff, but the traps came from Lou. He brought them over and stacked them on the wharf for me, as I remember. I was 11 or 12. And I fished those for a little while, and then during high school I was a sternman for Donnie Brown on Oars Island for the 4 years I was in high school. And then I struck out for greener pastures. Florida and Louisiana I thought were going to be exciting places to go. They weren't. I quickly learned that I didn't like not having a change of seasons, so I came back to Maine, and I'm not sorry that I did that. Although after I got married, my wife being from Shebig Island, we decided that maybe that was a good spot to make a home. So I went over there, I lobstered a little bit, and I got shanghaied into another part of the fishing business. I had finished hauling traps on a Friday, and some friends of mine worked on a sardine carrier. And this particular one, the Luann, had been re-rigged to purse seine, to hold a net to purse seine the fish with, and then they would load other carriers. And they said, well, would you like to go on a trip? I needed a little extra money. And they said, well, you know, you can come with us and make a trip, and you can earn some extra money. I said, okay, but I got to be back by Monday morning because I'm going to be hauling traps. They said, oh, don't worry about it. So I went with them. 4 days later, they finally brought me back to Shebig, and I called up my boss and said, you know, I'm really sorry. I didn't know these guys. We were fishing out of Rockland at the time, so I had ridden down to Rockland with them. And anyway, they didn't let me off the boat, and they didn't give me a ride back for 4 days. So middle of the week, I get back to Shebig Island. I called the fisherman up that I was working for. I said, I'm really sorry. I'll be there in the morning. And I don't know what to tell you. I didn't know these guys were going to do that. He says, no problem. He says, I know those guys. He said, it doesn't surprise me a bit that they would do that. He said, but don't waste your time coming to work in the morning. And he says, I've already replaced you. Whew. And I said, well, okay. And I went back to these supposed friends of mine, and I said, thanks very much. It just cost me my job. And they said, oh, don't worry about that a bit. We'll take great care of you. You're on our crew now. So I spent the next 6 years purse seining herring, and spent 6 days a week living on the Luann, which had originally been built to hold a crew of 2, and there was a crew of 8 of us on board. So it was
close,
rugged living. It ended up that I was the cook for most of those 6 years. But it was an experience. And I gave that up to go to work at Bath Iron Works. I needed to get a real job to pay the bills with. But I really enjoyed the time fishing. I didn't make a lot of money at it, but it was probably the most enjoyable job I had. In the winters, we'd be down in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and then as the season progressed, there was a lull between probably February and the 4th of July, when the weather was bad, the fish weren't around too much. You might get a load of fish, maybe not. But after the 4th of July, the fish would start to migrate along the Maine coast, and we would leave Gloucester, and we might be in Casco Bay for a week or 2, and then down off Booth Bay, and then we would keep going to the east and end up down off Jonesport area a lot of times. And that was probably the end of the sardine industry. Sardines being a type of herring. Nowadays, when you go to a store, you can still find sardines that are packed in a can, and there might be 12 or 14 of these small fish in the can, but you're more likely to find what they call steaks and fillets, because the herring are large, offshore herring now, and so they're big enough so that you can cut them through the body, which makes them steaks, or you can actually fillet them along the backbone. They're still packed kind of the same way in different kinds of oils, or mustard, or hot sauce, that sort of thing. But you don't find domestic sardines like you used to, say, before and just after World War II. Tuna fish has kind of taken over the market that sardines used to have. It was very common during World War II to have a can of sardines in your lunchbox and some saltine crackers or a piece of bread, and take the fish out and make yourself a quick sandwich out of them, and you don't have that anymore.
Right. The only person I know who did as you did, went to Florida right after high school, was my classmate Billy Bibber. And he was a colorful character, but he went to Florida shortly after we graduated from Brunswick High School and walked into a shipping office down there and said he was Captain William I. Bibber from Harpswell, Maine, and he understood that they probably wouldn't want to take him on as captain right away, but he'd take a job as mate, and they could see whether he could do it or not. And so they took a little test they gave him, and he passed it. And they took him on as mate, and within a year he was captain of a coastal tanker.
There you go.
And he did that all his working life, all the way over to the coast of Africa and Gulf of Mexico.
I did spend one winter in the Gulf of Mexico working on an oil supply boat. And I got down there having done no homework. I didn't know where I was going. I tore a page out of the yellow pages with some supply boat companies and just went door to door and knocked on the door. And I discovered that I didn't have very good success until the first thing I said was, I'm Gerry York and I'm from Maine and I'm looking for a job. And as soon as I said I was from Maine, they were like, well, why don't you come in and sit down?
Right.
And
well, that's the main work ethic, and it's recognized.
It is. I hope it still is, but at that time it really made a difference in getting the job. I was turned away several times before I would lead off with, and I'm from Maine. But I only spent one winter down there doing that, and again I discovered that I didn't like it. I didn't like the heat. There were a number of Maine boys down there, and we all would leave by the 1st of May. It was so hot that none of us could stand it. And the shipping companies down there kind of made allowances for that as well. They recognized that all the Maine boys were going to leave for the summer, right. But they made sure that your job was still available for you in the fall when they expected that you'd come back again. And I know I didn't do it myself. I only made it through the one winter there before I got tripped up by a female and ended up getting married. But I know several local guys that went down there and did that sort of thing for a number of years running, and they always had a job when they got back there.
Right. And there were also several people from the Neck that I know of, Charlie Bibber for one, who ran a boatyard up here and did a little bit of boat repair and building, but every fall, 1st of November, whatever he was doing, carpenter work, working on a boat, he would throw his tools in a bag, throw them in the car, they'd get in the car and go to Florida. Mm-hmm. He had a job at a yacht yard down there, and when he walked in the door, he went to work every year.
Yep.
They recognized that guys from Maine like that were better workmen and more reliable than the people they had down there. Mm-hmm. So they were pretty much guaranteed a job if they wanted
that's what I found as well. Yeah.
And what else have you worked at, Gerry?
I built a few houses here and there. My cousin was Lester Harris. He was a pretty well-known contractor in the area, and so I would work for him off and on. My first job with him was on Eagle Island. The state had just received Admiral Perry's house from the family, and it needed a new roof. And Lester and his crew went out to shingle the roof. And my first job, I was maybe 14 or 15, but I hadn't done any carpentry work, so I was put to work lugging bundles of shingles up the ladders and spreading them out on the roof and picking up the shingles that were coming off. Everybody they peeled them off and just flung them off the roof. And so
I know about working for Lester. I worked for him too. In fact, I probably got done about the time you started.
yeah, I remember you and my brother sitting at my mother's kitchen table having lunch
Yeah.
while you were working for Lester.
Yeah.
But I don't remember you being around when I started to work for Lester.
Right.
So that was probably right in that general time frame. And Ronnie didn't work for Lester. I don't think he was working for Lester either when I started. I think he had already moved on to other things. Chip Black was also one of Lester's employees when I was younger, and I think he had moved on by the time I came along. So I didn't have any brothers or cousins to look out for me, although Lester was a cousin.
We all figured we had brains and experience enough to do our own work, so we had moved on.
Well, that was my first job, and it was interesting. It was a boat ride every morning and every evening to get out there and back, but the building was very interesting. As I say, the Peary family had only just turned it over to the state, so there were still a lot of items that belonged to the Pearys that have now. There are still a lot of items out there, but a lot of that stuff I think went to Bowdoin College after a period of time. But it was fun to just walk through the building and see everything. And
yeah, before the state took it over, the buildings were pretty much open, and we, once every 5 years would go out there by boat and take a walk around the island and peek in the windows. And
well, as I remember, I don't think that the front door was locked very often. I think you could walk right in.
Right, and it's amazing that it survived.
It is.
With it wide open like that.
Yep. Yeah, it is. But they've done a nice job. Been out there for 10 or 15 years now, but they've done a nice restoration job to everything out there.
We just received at the museum a box of ivory and bone artifacts that came from the Peary estate from Brian Marden, who is his grandfather worked for Admiral Peary.
Was that Hewler?
Hewler's father.
Hewler's father.
And Hewler. And Edith, who just passed away, had these things. She and Hewler had these things for years. So it's pretty interesting stuff.
I don't know how many folks from the Neck participated, but when Peary would come in from an Arctic trip, he would stop off the end of Bailey Island and would contact some of his friends that lived at Bailey Island, my grandfather Dowdy being one of them, and they would go off, the story I've heard anyway, is they would go off and take anything that Peary felt the government would not allow him to have. They'd take it off, take it back to Bailey Island. Peary would go into Portland, pass through customs, return to Eagle Island, and then all the fishermen would ferry the contraband back out to Eagle Island. And on occasion, the story is that they were allowed to choose something to keep on their own. I don't know whether they were allowed to or whether they just confiscated something, but my grandfather's house had a walrus tusk and a narwhal horn, and seems like there were a couple of other things that were related to the Arctic, but those are the two that I can think of in particular. And my cousin Joe Harris, who was a brother to Lester, can remember when he was a kid, he would go down there and play, and that walrus tusk was one of his toys. It was stored in the bottom of the closet. He'd drag it out, and I don't know what he did with it, but he'd push it around the floor, and it would rock back and forth, and so forth. And the narwhal tusk I haven't seen for a long time. I think it's still down there in my grandfather's house. But it had a corkscrew, kind of a spiral to it. And I was always fascinated with that. but probably there must be some other houses that have Arctic artifacts in them
I'm sure.
that all came from Peary.
I think Bowdoin received probably the best collection of that stuff from
I'm
the,
sure they did,
from the
yeah.
estate.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
I
That
know
house
there
was
are
solid full.
notes in the Harpswell Board of Selectmen's meetings where they paid the owners of sheep because Admiral Peary's dogs had killed sheep,
Yep.
had come ashore down to Basin Point or gone to another island and killed some sheep.
Yeah, I know he tried to keep them on Flag Island, but I'm sure that they could swim, and
Yep, there were.
if they saw a food source on the next piece of land, they probably didn't hesitate to
No, they
migrate over.
pick off a meal. Yes.
Yep.
How about the stores on Orr's Island? There was Doughty's store.
There was Ruth Dowdy's store.
There was a store on the corner above Doughty's store.
Yeah, that's what
Can't remember the name of the people who ran it.
well, they called that corner Robinson's Corner, and that was kind of if you weren't at Prince's Point, where the Prince family had their store, the next center of activity was at the head of Lowell's Cove at Orr's Island, which would have encompassed this Robinson's Corner.
Okay.
So there was a post office there. I think there was, at one point anyway, there was some kind of a store there. I don't think it stocked a lot of items, but I think there was a store with the post office in one end of it that the Huff family ran.
Yeah.
Across from it was Hillman's grocery store. That was still running when I was a kid. Pat and Mildred Hillman ran that. Prior to that, behind that building, there was Harv Black's store. Harv Black was a fishing schooner captain, but he retired and opened up a grocery store. And at one point in the, I'm going to say 1930s, that building burned and was never rebuilt. So there's just an open lot there behind what was later Hillman's store.
Okay. I recall playing baseball with Jason Hillman.
Okay.
Same family or a different family?
The Jason Hillman I know is a younger man.
This would have been his father, I think.
So there was Pat and Mildred had Ernest, and Ernest had a son, Ernest, whom they called Nirna. And he would have probably been your age.
Okay.
But I think he was Ernest Jr. And he had a sister, Diana.
Well, you remember them better than I do, that's for sure.
Yeah. And then just to the east of Hillman's store was an ice cream shop and a barber shop, and that belonged to the Robinsons. And Joshua Robinson, I guess probably prior to the Hillmans and Harv Black, Joshua Robinson had a store there. So that's how we got the term Robinson's Corner.
I see.
So there'd been a store there quite some time. And then if you go down over the hill to Lowell's Cove and go out around, like you're going to the backside of Lowell's Cove, there's a white house right at the head of what we call Flag Cove. That was originally, they tell me, so I've read, was a store that belonged to the Sinnets. Now, it's never been a store in my lifetime, and I don't think it's been a store in the last 120 years. But prior to that, they tell me that it was a store. And on Little Island in Lowell's Cove, the Linscotts, that's kind of where they had the hub of their fishing business. There were 3 fish houses there. You can still find photos and postcards that show these 3 fish houses on Little Island. One of those was kind of like a chandlery. I'm sure it had some grocery staples in there as well, but the fishing boats would come in there. They could get nets and twine, but they could also get some food items. And then the other 2 fish houses were built so that they shared a common wall, even though they had 2 pitched roofs. It looks like they were 2 separate buildings, but they shared a wall. And that wall had been taken out, and there was a clam and mackerel canning factory in there for a short period of time. That the Linscotts owned the buildings. I think there was a man by the name of Brown who came from Portland that actually ran the cannery. And the Linscotts had a fish pound, a fish net, on the end of Little Island. And they would buy clams as well from the locals. And they would can clams and mackerel in those buildings.
While we're in the neighborhood, tell us what you can about Redmen's Hall. When it was built, how many members maybe, and when it was sort of, I recall when there were dances held upstairs, but I don't think the building was used much, even in my growing up years.
Well, the Independent Order of Redmen was a fraternal organization, similar to the Masons. And there were a number of fraternal organizations around. They were quite big in the early 1900s. Mm-hmm. The Redmen originally met at Lowell's Cove in what later became the Moss Factory at Lowell's Cove. The Moss Factory consisted of a drying plant on the west side of the road, and a wharf and a collection point for all the sea moss was on the shore side. The upper part of that building was called Seaside Hall, and it was just a big open area. It had an outside set of stairs, and it was used for a lot of community functions. Among them was meetings for the Redmen. That was probably 1900, 1905, and about 1910-ish, 1909, 1910. The Redmen collected enough money through their membership to have Redmen's Hall constructed. I believe they got the piece of property was donated. Somewhere I've seen the deed. It's got a lady's name on it, but I can't remember it right offhand. But they had the building constructed 1909, 1910. That sort of thing. And everybody owned a share in it. It was all by prescription. And it became used, it had an upstairs that was used for functions, and that's where the Redmen met. And the lower levels had a big hardwood floor, but it was also a very open area and could be used for community events. I know they put on plays there, musicals. They would have dances there. My mother talks about going roller skating there. I've heard some folks talk about a gentleman from Brunswick who had a movie theater in Brunswick, and he would bring movies down and show them in Redmen's Hall, probably in the 1940s and 50s. But it belonged to the Redmen, but it was treated as a community center. And then at various times, it was used for town meetings. I guess there was an effort made to hold town meetings in various parts of town, since we were, until the late 70s when the bridge was built, it was a real difficult thing to get from one side of town to the other. So the town meetings were sometimes held in Redmen's Hall as well. I'm going to say it was in the early 1950s that the red men kind of died out at Orr's Island. And I believe that at that point in time, most of their regalia that they had stored there got moved to the Cundy's Harbor fire station, which had a hall on the upper levels. And the Red Men did, as an organization, did continue to operate there for a few years. But as many of the fraternal organizations have done now, they lost a lot of members. The members were all getting older, and it kind of died out. And some of those artifacts, I think some of the costumes have ended up at the Harpswell Historical Society. Someone rescued those and put them on display. But at that point, Redmen's Hall at Orr's Island still continued to be a community hall, but the Redmen were not active anymore. And in the earlier mid-60s, the district Redmen organization, which was in Pownell, I believe, was maintaining the Redmen's Hall down here, and they decided that was a drain, and it needed to be sold, and the Redmen down here didn't exist anymore, so they put it up for sale, and it was sold to Wes Shaw, who lived a few doors away. And my mother was somewhat involved with that sale, and she was always very embarrassed about her involvement with the sale. My mother was a mail carrier on Orr's Island and knew a lot of people. She'd gone to North Yarmouth Academy, and one of the people that she'd gone to North Yarmouth Academy with was part of the Red Men organization in Pownell. And he called her up one day and he said, well, Mr. Shaw wants to buy the building, but we want it to continue to be a community building. Do you think we should sell it to him? What do you think will be the bottom line on that? And she said, I can't imagine that he wouldn't continue to let it be a community center. It has been for years, and she said, I think it would be, in my opinion, it would be all right to sell it to him, which they did. And within a week, a padlock went on the door, and I myself have only been in the building one time in my life in 63 years, and it's now in an unknown state of repair at this point, but I have an idea that it's been 50 years that it hasn't had any maintenance done to the building. It's still there, but it's no longer a community building. And my mother was always very upset about her involvement in having ultimately wrestled that community building away from use. So the Red Men organization nationally still does exist. There are still Red Men, but I think it died out in the mid-50s at Cundy's Harbor. It might have lasted even up until 1960. I'm not sure of that. But.
Okay, you want to talk about something else, or you want to give us a little dissertation on life in Harpswell?
I can't think of anything else right off the top of my head.
Okay.
Life in Harpswell.
Yeah.
As we all do, I guess. I miss the good old days when I was a kid in Harpswell.
You probably were part of the rifle group.
I was not. My brother was. Yeah. He's 12 years older than I am. He was part of that. My father was an instructor for the rifle club. By the time I came along, it had pretty much dissolved. The Micmac Rifle Club, it was called. And it was held, they had a shooting range down at Reed Cove on Oars Island. My father was an instructor, as I said. Gary Anderson, I think I remember being an instructor at one point. But I missed out on the rifle club.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
And as usual, I'm old enough so that when you interrupt me, I have no clue what it was I was talking about.
About life in Harpswell.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we all think of the good old days as being our youth. Your good old days are probably different than my good old days, but
Not much.
I can, we talk about a loss of innocence. Nowadays, you just couldn't do the things that you did even when I was a kid. I would run the neighborhood, and it's not like you were running wild and nobody was watching you, because everybody was watching you. Every backyard you went through, there was somebody's mother or father saw you go, knew where you were headed, knew who you were with, and if they didn't think that you were doing something that you should have been doing, your parents would get a phone call.
Right.
Or they'd just call you over and say, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? And don't you think you ought to go do something different? And you can't do that. Now, nobody cared whose property you were running over. Things were wide open, and because of that, we usually respected other people's property. Right. We might have used it, we might have crossed it, but you didn't do things to it to jeopardize that being able to do that.
Right.
I can remember the whole south end of Oars Island was my playground, and I was probably quarter to a half a mile away from home most of the day, but I really wasn't unsupervised. Even though I didn't have a parent in a back pocket or an adult standing there, you knew you weren't going to get away with much bad behavior, because somebody was going to see you, and they knew where you came from. They knew who you were. They knew where you came from. They knew who your parents were, and they knew their telephone number.
Right.
But I can remember it was nothing to hitchhike. That was either a bicycle or a thumb was the mode of transportation for a lot of us. I would sometimes, I won't go into why, but I would sometimes get kept after school at the Harpswell Island School, and not getting on the bus wasn't a problem. When I got turned loose, I could go down over the hill, stand there for about 3 minutes, and the first or second car that went by, you just stuck your thumb out. They knew who you were, they knew where you were going, and they probably knew what you'd done at school to get kept afterwards. But I could be home in no time.
Right.
I rarely ever hitched a ride going toward Brunswick, but if you were on Great Island and you were going south, you could pretty much depend on not having more than about 2 cars go by before you could get a ride to wherever you were going. Right. And you can't do that anymore.
And it isn't safe to ride a bicycle as it was in those days.
No, and when I was riding bicycles on the road, we were always taught to ride facing the traffic so you could see what was coming, so that you could get off the road when a vehicle was coming. You didn't ride in the road. You stopped if there was a car coming, and you got off into the dirt. Right. I don't know whether it's any safer to do it the way they do now, riding with the flow of traffic, or not, but I would prefer to see what was coming at me rather than not knowing what's coming from behind me. But the roads, they weren't any wider or narrower. now than they were then. But if you were on a bicycle, you didn't push your luck. The car had the right of way,
Right.
and you got out of the way. So that's something that you don't have anymore, is that sort of freedom. But you don't have that same sort of attitude with people anymore, either on the bicycles or in the cars. Another thing because we were kind of a closed community up until World War II, everybody was related to everyone else. You did have the summer residents, but a lot of times they had been coming for so many years that you knew who they were and they knew who you were as well. But one thing that I suppose it's not unique to this area, but it was the way you interacted with older people, with adults when you were a kid. I have a number of adults that I interacted with that weren't my relatives, but I always referred to them as aunt and uncle. And I think that was, you knew them too well to call them Mr. or Mrs., but you couldn't have the familiarity and the lack of respect for them to call them by their first name. So you would call them aunt and uncle. So I lived next to Harriet and Jim Huff. They were always Aunt Harriet and Uncle Jim. I'm not related to them. There were a number of other instances like that. My best friend had an Uncle John. That's the way we referred to him. He was Uncle John. He was not my uncle, but it was a sign of respect for the older folks that you don't get anymore. I was kind of fond of that way of thinking of people as aunt and uncle. As a matter of fact, I was a teenager before I really realized that they weren't my aunt and uncle, or they weren't related to me. They had just always been aunt and uncle.
Yeah.
I'm about done, I guess.
Well, thank you, Jerry.
Hey ho, roll and go around Cape Horn to San Francisco. Shantyman, sing, boys, pull on the line, and we're back in record time. Now at Bath down in Maine, they built many tall ships. They were paired up and flanked and launched down the slips. The strength of our nation was built on the pine of the mast trees that harnessed the wind. There was schooners and sloops and all kinds of small craft. There were warships with cannon both forward and aft, and the queens of the seas, downeasters and clippers, mighty proud men were their skippers, with their hey-ho, roll and go.